Secretly recorded from deep inside the bowels of a decommissioned missile silo, we bring you the man, one single man who wants to bring light to the darkness and dark to the lightness. Although he's not always right, he is always certain. So now, with security protocols in place, the protesters have been forced back behind the barricades and the blast doors are now sealed. Without further delay, let me introduce you to the host of HuttCast, Mr. Tim Huttner.
Thank you, Sergeant-at-Arms. You can now take your post. Happy glorious Sunday today in HuttCast. We have a guest in our studio today. Senator Michelle Benson is with us. Senator, thanks for coming in and giving up some of your busy schedule.
I'm glad to have been invited. I'm looking forward to this.
Well, let's have some fun. HuttCast will be right back, and we will talk some issues. Stand by. Buying a gun is no ordinary purchase. Whether you're a hunter, competitive shooter, or self-defense is your priority, there are many kinds of guns and many kinds of training programs. You use your brain all the time. You will rarely need to use your gun. Before you find yourself in a situation where you need to make a critical decision, make sure your training is the best you can get. It could be the difference between life and death, or freedom or detention. For the best quality training, check out permittocarry.us. If you live in Minnesota or Wisconsin or even Florida, give Gene German a call, 612-388-2403. That's Permit to Carry US. Or call Gene German at 612-388-2403.
I'm Michelle Benson, and I approve this message.
Welcome back to HuttCast. In our studio today, Senator Michelle Benson. She is in with us and giving us her very, very hard to get time because, you know, when you're in campaign mode, you are like totally running 24/7. Michelle, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here, and it's nice to do it on a Sunday afternoon. Evenings get a little bit tough, and so thank you for accommodating my schedule.
Not a worry. Michelle, let's start out with who you are.
I'm born and raised here in Minnesota. I grew up on a farm in Swift County, Dublin Township, actually. My mom and dad worked and bought the land, and they've now passed it on to us kids. My brothers farm that land. My sister married a dairy farmer out there, and so she and her family farm as well. So I'm connected to greater Minnesota. I really love the way that I grew up. I had both sets of my grandparents nearby, multiple sets of aunts and uncles. I had 2 cousins in my classes all the way from kindergarten through high school graduation. So really sort of an idyllic life. As I look back now, what an incredible blessing to be surrounded.
It sounds like a wonderful area to be in.
Yeah. And then graduated from high school, worked my way through college, got a chemistry degree at St. Catherine's. And a lot of people will say, how'd you get from chemistry to politics? Well, life sometimes takes us on circuitous paths. And I think more and more of us find that where we thought we'd begin, we didn't end up. And so again, the blessings of people who come into your life. While I was in college, I met my husband, Craig. He was a handsome man from the United States Naval Academy, and we met my sophomore year at St. Catherine's. And sort of head over heels. I suppose you're not supposed to say that now because then kids think head over heels always works out. But we've now been married 31 years. We spent 5 years with the United States Navy Nuclear Submarine Corps after Craig was commissioned and I graduated. And we came back here to Minnesota. And I tell you, some of our closest friends are still in our life because of our time in the Navy. It is a completely different life than the one I grew up with on the farm or the one that Craig grew up with. His family lived north of Cross Lake, actually here in Minnesota. They had a garbage service. And so, living near an ocean, meeting people from all over the world was something we'd never experienced. It was a great part of our life. We treasure it. But we came back here.
Quite a lifestyle, huh?
Yeah, when his service was over. And then I got my M.B.A. Because when you have a chemistry undergrad, sometimes you need a reboot. So I got my M.B.A. and I'd taken enough classes to actually sit for the CPA exam. So I passed the CPA exam. I went to work for an auditing and accounting firm. I did a little bit of work in taxes, but decided I liked being involved in the audit part of the business and the business decision-making part of that business. And so worked for a few years doing that. But then when our oldest son was born, I became a stay-at-home mom. And we have 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. Being a mom really helped me refocus on some of the things that I'd grown up with, some of the things that mattered to me, that connection to family. I volunteered a lot at church and school. I had Cub Scouts in my basement, made sure that Snacks and Bats were always at their baseball games. And in 2006, I started to get a little bit more involved in politics. I'd always loved history and was very proud of our country, and had seen my parents, through their example, be somewhat involved in politics. But in 2006, I became a delegate and continued, raising my family and all of those things. But in 2010, your listeners will remember the Affordable Care Act had passed in Washington in 2009. Minnesota had really good health care, had low uninsured rates. We were doing okay. We didn't need Washington to tell us what to do. And I loved the separation that we had between the federal government and the states, that the states should be laboratories of democracy, laboratories of economic innovation, laboratories of policymaking. And the more Washington takes over, the less innovation we get at the states. And so
we'll cover some of this later in the show.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So we want to make sure, and let's find out about you.
Okay.
It's easy to go down the rabbit hole. We don't want to go, we hate the Dems, we hate the Rebs, we hate the lefts. We don't want to do that.
Yeah. And I wasn't going into, why somebody's wrong and somebody's right. But this is what motivated me, that I wanted my state to be strong, to be innovative, that we could learn things and not have everything decided in one place. Republican or Democrat, I don't think Washington should be making as many decisions as they do for Minnesota or any other state. Yeah.
And you're in good company with that, because a lot of listeners are, we get a lot on both sides of the fence, but common sense is a tool that's no longer used much anymore, and they need to go back to that.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. So you told us where you're from. So you're in a farm situation. Your parents have had that. So you understand the business side of Minnesota. And sometimes you get these left and right, way out of the box, start paying taxes. I know you're against the high tax thing, and I get it, and who isn't? What would you tell a business in Minnesota if you became governor about our tax structure, what do we have? Disparity tax. I'm a business as well. And we keep getting hit with these disparities like you wouldn't believe.
The fiscal disparities?
Yeah, pick one.
Yeah, well, if you are taxed in Minnesota, you are probably taxed at a higher rate than you would be in any other state, especially when it comes to a corporate tax, or if you're a pass-through entity. So an LLP, an LLC, sole proprietorship, you get taxed at a higher rate than in most other states. And so what does that say to someone who wants to take a risk, who wants to be innovative? When you become successful, you either need to move to a different state or you need to pay really high taxes. And so lowering taxes isn't just I'm a Republican, this is a talking point. It is, how do we attract people who think differently, who innovate, who want to take a risk? As software becomes a bigger and bigger part of our economy, software developers can live anywhere. And if they want a really high quality of life, access to the outdoors, they can live in a lot of places in greater Minnesota, but they can also live in a lot of places in Tennessee or Utah. And their tax structure is going to be much different than it is here in Minnesota.
Right.
And so if we're a highly mobile economy, why should we be pushing people to go live somewhere else when we can lower our tax rates and attract them here? We never mistake my criticism of our tax policies or our government policies for criticism of our state or our people. Growing up where I did, I saw incredible work ethic, people who thought differently, struggled, tried really hard, but I also saw beautiful places to live, access to lakes and rivers that you just don't have in some other places. Yes, we have seasons, and January and February can be miserable, but we also have, like, a day like today, it is March, and you just want to be outside and put the windows down on the car and embrace the outdoors. And that's really...
And here you are in the studio spending your time.
That's
for
okay.
you, the people. She's donating her time.
I had the windows down on the way over, so my hair's a little messy, but that's okay. It's Minnesota and Sunday, and it's a podcast.
We're good to go.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So with that high quality of life you can have in Minnesota, let's make it a place where innovators want to live and where they want to produce and where their dreams, their ambitions are welcome and not punished in our tax code.
I had to chuckle when you came in, and you actually noticed the patents on the wall. And nobody really notices them except you. And you said that you had at work, and how'd that go?
Well, when I was in college, I worked at 3M, and I worked for Dr. Neil Randon, actually, at 3M, and he had polymer patents. And in business school, you learn a little bit about patent law. But one of the great things we do in our country is say, you created this. We're going to give you exclusive rights to it for a period of time. And it's also sort of a badge of honor to say, I thought of something that nobody thought of before. I'm doing something differently than somebody ever thought to do it before. And I got a piece of paper on my wall that says I did it and I proved it.
And the $40,000 debt per unit, yes.
Well, okay, and there is a downside to getting a patent, and I understand that from a business perspective. But Minnesota should be a place where we do things like patents. I read a book by Peter Thiel called 0 to 1, where he believes that the United States, and I believe Minnesota, should be the place where if nothing exists and an idea is sparked, it grows here. We go from 0 of something to 1 of something, because China can produce things on a mass scale, and the United States can produce things on an innovative scale, but we can't really compete. If you just want to make cardboard boxes, you're going to probably do those pretty well in China. Or if you want to make little plastic components,
sure,
probably
right.
do that pretty well in China. But if nothing exists in that space, he talks about word processors. So we had computers and we had typewriters. And somebody said,
let's put these together.
What if we had a computer that is a typewriter, or a typewriter that's a computer? And they patented it, and it became the first. So let's make Minnesota the place where the first thing happens. And let's do some specialty manufacturing. Let's reward that kind of innovation.
So to answer your question, I got sidetracked as well. What are you going to do for the business people in the city or in the state?
I think lower taxes, pull back on some of our regulations. We don't need to make it expensive or difficult to start or maintain a business here. We do have some workforce challenges. That needs to be part of our solution as well. So making sure that our kids are well educated and prepared with those skills necessary to function in a modern economy. And I don't mean training them to be programmers. If that's what they want to do, that's their ambition, let's do that. If they want to be a diesel mechanic, that's their ambition. Let's make sure that they have a pathway to choose that. But some of those executive skills of being work ready, you show up on time, you know how to follow through on a task, you're literate, you can read, you can do some basic math, you can do logical thinking, you understand enough about our society to function in it well. And then go get the skills you need to become part of this 0 to 1 innovation economy.
Did you know that in Australia, that if you have no reason to be moving there, that they will deny you? If you had a patent, they would say, okay, you are contributing to society. If you had a lot of money, you're contributing to society. And it's on their intake papers. I've actually had a kid from my hydrogen class schools say he needed his certificates. And I says, why? He says, because Australia requires them. But yet we don't require them here in this country. Come on in, help yourself, get on the government dole, we'll pay for it. What do you say about that?
Well, I would love our immigration policy to be, come here, live the American dream, which means you work hard, you make your own way. Eventually you own a home. Your kids are well educated. You're safe. That's an important part of being American. As you look around the world, there are places where you're not safe, but you have to bring something to contribute. We're a melting pot. Make this country stronger. That should be the purpose of immigration, and we should welcome that in our country.
Now, when the big T, I don't want to use his name, but you know who he is,
Yes.
was jumping up and down about this border thing, the guys in the South, in Texas and Arizona, were screaming for help. I think he believed that he wanted to try and help, but our current administration is just not have the same focus on this, or until that we're in a situation where it has to become a crisis. Your thoughts there?
Well, having an open border really is, I wouldn't say dangerous. There are some people who will come across that border and try to commit crimes, foment gang wars, transfer drugs. It's the trafficking of children, I think, is a real occurrence on our border. And I am deeply concerned about the well-being of kids who aren't coming in through an orderly immigration process. So if we're going to have immigration, which we need, our ag producers need people who are willing to do that kind of hard work. And I've met a number of Mexican immigrants who came here legally, got their green card, are now working on citizenship. They're not afraid of hard work, but they love the idea that they can have their kids educated. They can own a home. They can start a business of their own, whether it's a little cafe in town or a house cleaning service. In addition to, this is the amazing thing. They do the work that they were hired for in the green card, and then they keep finding other ways to be entrepreneurial because they're embracing what we as Americans have forgotten, that we are a land of amazing potential because we are free and we educate our people and we value innovation and new ideas and hard work. And so we forget what some immigrants experience and why they make such good citizens when they become legal citizens.
But they came here, the premise of doing it right, coming to the country right.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's the way it should be. Not just open the borders and say, here, flood us, and where do you want to ship to?
Exactly.
We were if I believe, we were a dumping ground for some of these people. And at my very core, I'm like, hold on here. We have policies in place for this at the federal level. Why are we not following them?
And I think, I look at possible refugees coming from Ukraine or some of the refugees from Afghanistan. And particularly in Afghanistan, if you fought next to our folks, if you've already stood with America, we should have a place for you.
For sure.
But you need to come here with the best interests of America as part of your plan.
Well said. Very, very well said. Okay, let's shift some gears here. You were on a farm. Did you grow up on that farm?
I did.
And you were the one that when you were like 6 years old, Dad says, here, steer straight, and we're going to work around it. Was that you too?
Well, let's step back a little bit. My family has always farmed. My mom and dad both grew up on farms. My grandparents came from farming families. And so I didn't know any differently. But yes, go out, you're going to pick rocks.
Yep.
This is what we're going to do.
Yep.
You're going to learn to run a grease gun. The first vehicle I ever drove, I think it was shortly after my first communion. I want to say it was about 8. My dad put me in a grain truck, put it in first gear, said, don't touch anything, just head for the other end of the field. And he ran to the other end of the field because as one person trying to run trucks from one end of the field to the other, having someone who could help you get that truck part way down or most of the way down. And I remember him running back and he hopped in and, stepped on the brake, and then I scooted over and he finished getting it to the end of the field and up next to the combine where he needed it. But it certainly, as soon as I could be helpful, I was expected to be helpful.
Would you expect that kind of help from the Democratic Party if you made governor?
I think I would expect that from the people of Minnesota. Everybody help in the way that you can.
And do you believe that we've lost some of that?
Yes, I do. I think we've become really polarized. and isolated. Some of it's social media, some of it's politics, some of it's our ability to only take in information that we want to hear in the way we want to hear it. No offense to podcasters.
Hey, I hear you.
We need to cross-train, listen to people you don't agree with, see if there are parts of their ideas you haven't thought about. But really, if we're willing to pull together, if we're willing, I hate to say row in the same direction, I think that gets to be an overused analogy. But one of the things that I've learned as Health and Human Services Chair, there are people with incredible challenges who get up every single day trying to be as productive as they can, trying to live a life that is filled with hope, that moves towards a bright future. And maybe they're quadriplegic, or maybe they have some other disability, Down syndrome or cerebral palsy, and they still get up every day and try.
Hats off to them.
And if every single one of us did that, what an amazing state we would be.
Why don't we just keep doing it?
Let's keep doing it.
Yeah. So you mentioned something. You're the chair of Health and Human Services.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to grab some overdrive here and talk about some things that I have in the Senate right now through Senator John Hoffman and through Mark Coran. It is called the William Shakespeare Law. Now, I'm not doing this so you beat up on Waltz.
Sure.
I'm doing this because it's kind of a real thing and we've lived it. This is not a political itch for me. This is not nothing. We lost a family member, and it was during the COVID stuff. And the way we were treated as a family was third worldish, was disgusting. Now, we're a right to try state, correct?
Yes.
And if the proxies or the people for the patient, the advocates, say, we're going to try ivermectin or whatever. We had Dr. Scott Jensen on the show, and he you can know where he went with this.
Yeah.
Why is the health system saying, we're not going to prescribe this? We're not going to do this. It's not on our list. We don't want this to happen because it doesn't fit the Democratic agenda. I'm still in awe. But this William Shakespeare bill that we're introducing, which I hope we have your support on because this is kind of what it is, leaves the family in control, not the healthcare system.
And with any drug that needs to be prescribed, you need a doctor to do that prescribing.
Yep.
One of my problems with what happened during COVID, politicians, the press, pharmacists were saying, doctors don't get to choose how they treat their patients. We're going to tell them what to do. We're going to shame them. In the case of Scott Jensen, people tried to threaten his medical license.
Twice, 3 times I heard.
Actually, it's about 6.
Oh, I'm way off.
So we have a state law. Let me just pause there for a minute. We have a state law that says the Board of Medical Practice must investigate all complaints. And we do that so that if there's a doctor on the board who's a friend with a complainant, that the investigation will still go forward. Or if they're friends with somebody who is the subject of a complaint, the complaint still goes forward. We don't want any favoritism. But what that law also allowed is some social media activists to file complaints against Dr. Jensen's license. And the investigations had to go forward and they were dismissed once Dr. Jensen responded to them. And complaints are kept private. The state doesn't make the complaints. The state doesn't make them public. So the complaints are private and the respondents can choose whether to make them public or not. And Dr. Jensen did choose to make them public, but they were found to be, I think the term is without merit, but nobody quote me on that. But if there was a finding, then that finding would have been public. And so while we're talking about this, know that the state didn't release anything. The Board of Medical Practice didn't release anything. But there's actually a law. I had a bill that I had written up that Senator Draheim, Senator Scott Newman, and myself are signed on to that would say if a complaint comes off social media, then the board may decline to investigate. So that way, actually, it's a public forum, including social media. If we think about what doctors went through during COVID, if they were saying, how about we try ivermectin, and somebody didn't like the fact that they said that, whether that person was a patient or not, the doctor could have a complaint filed against them.
Cancel culture.
That doesn't seem just or fair, nor does it allow doctors to use their judgment in the practice of medicine because they feel threatened.
Right.
That is not the way the practice of medicine is supposed to work.
It's a shame, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I think that Dr. Scott Jensen has a lot of callous from that, and I feel for him, and I don't blame him, because they try to cancel culture him by attacking him. And literally all he's trying to do is help people. So I get that. But if you were the governor, would you pinch on that? Would you squeeze it off?
Governors shouldn't interfere with the practice of medicine and shouldn't interfere with medical boards. This is where it's so hard for people to draw a line, with all due respect to the folks who are like, make doctors and hospitals give these drugs to my loved one. A doctor is responsible for their medical judgment. And so if you find a doctor who wants to prescribe ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, that doctor shouldn't be punished for the practice, but nor should someone be able to compel a physician to act against their conscience.
Sure.
If they don't believe the medicine will work, they shouldn't have to prescribe that medicine or have their license put at risk for that reason either. So we either allow the practice of medicine without interference from the press, the public, or politicians, or we don't.
Well, maybe if you do see that come across your desk, you'll give it a thumbs up. And it kind of holds the hospital association a little on the hook here for pinching guys who want to prescribe that. Agreed.
So, and hospitals shouldn't dictate to their doctors what good practice is. There should be, a collaboration agreement that exists between the hospital and the physician, and an understanding that physician practices medicine.
Well, maybe we get your support on that bill if it does come to fruition. Okay, what are we here? We are 25:19 into this first segment. Why don't we take a commercial break real quick, and we'll come back with, let's talk about, well, not to beat up Waltz, but how Waltz's report card is. That make sense to you?
That makes sense to me.
Okay, HuttCast. Again, 25 minutes, 34 seconds into this first segment. We're going to take a break. Stand by. We hear a lot about air quality these days. So keeping your indoor equipment running clean and efficiently is important to your health. The experts at Dependable Heating and Cooling in Coon Rapids have been servicing the Twin City areas for more than 25 years. With the latest and most efficient technology available, they will repair or replace your equipment and keep your indoor air healthy and comfortable. Call 763-757-5040. Our team of experts is standing by, waiting to help you with all your indoor needs. Mention you've heard about this by listening to the HuttCast podcast, and you will receive a $50 off any repair. That's Dependable Heating and Cooling. 763-757-5040. Dependable Heating and Cooling.
Hi, I'm Michelle Benson. You can learn more about my campaign at michelleformn.com.
Welcome back, HuttCast. Michelle Benson, Senator Michelle Benson, Health and Human Services Chair, is in our studio, gracing us with her presence today. I said it in pre-roll and in first segment, we're going to talk about Mr. Waltz. Tell me, Michelle, we all know the story behind the burning down South Minneapolis. We've all had friends in the PD. We've all had just a whole world of craziness going on. What's his report card? And how would you do a better difference of, would you call the guard out sooner? Just walk us through that timeline.
The murder of George Floyd brought out so many pent-up emotions in our city. And yes, people took to the streets. They felt that there was a travesty, a miscarriage of justice. And that is part of a very, very difficult story, a very sad story. I don't even know how to describe how those people feel because I did not have that experience. Letting them protest and make their voices heard and begin change was really important. But as soon as they broke a window, set a building on fire, threatened someone, they crossed a line. When that happened, we needed to move to order. There was no way that breaking glass had anything to do with a peaceful protest.
You're right.
So there should have been curfews. We should have brought in a quadrant of the National Guard, but brought in mutual aid from sheriffs, brought in troopers to make sure that as people were going in and out of Minneapolis and St. Paul, it was for work. It was because they lived there, not because they were coming in to foment violence. If we had set a curfew early, if we had had a show of strength, not a show of force, I think we would have had a very different outcome. There wouldn't, get that under control early, make sure that protests are allowed during the day. The people who assembled at Cup Foods at that corner
Right.
could have moved some of that grief forward, maybe found some more positive actions other than the things that were brought forward by radical leftist organizations, by people who were there to take the opportunity to loot and commit property destruction. Burning of buildings is not a peaceful protest.
It's a
Breaking
crime.
windows
Yeah.
is not a peaceful protest. And that could have been gotten under control much earlier than it was. Our cities would have been better off if we had treated those early actions as crimes instead of as protests.
Right. Until you introduced the Freedom Bail program. What is that one?
The Minnesota Freedom Fund,
There
where
you go.
they just give money and have no consequences. Here's the thing. Criminals need consequences.
Mhm.
And the Minnesota Freedom Fund was like, you know what? We're going to bail you out, no consequences. Bail is a consequence of you being charged with a crime.
Yes.
And if you were acquitted of that crime, bail is forgiven or removed as a penalty or as a condition. But the Minnesota Freedom Fund wanted there to be no conditions for being arrested for that crime. They didn't hold anyone accountable.
Who enacted that?
It's a nonprofit, an activist left nonprofit who lets people out of jail by bailing them out with cash bail.
Now, I had Kazelka on, I think it was Kazelka, that said that the money used to put up their bail, so if you create more of a heinous situation and your bail's $200,000, that once you're acquitted of that you get that $200K. Have you heard that?
If you're not found guilty, the bail goes back. Yeah, you get that money back.
Well, they didn't put the bail up. The Freedom Fund did. And the guy who created the crime gets to keep that.
And that I don't know. I don't know how that money flows. But if the person doesn't show up for court, bail's forfeit. And if the Minnesota Freedom Fund forfeits that bail, they'll just go out and raise more money. Kamala Harris will help them do it.
Right. Well, I wasn't quite sure if that was a thing. He told me that. I said, when some people get on, I'll ask them the same question.
And I will do some research and find out. I have actually a friend of Senator Corran's who could probably answer that question for me. So, Mark, when you hear this podcast, text me and remind me that I said this.
Oh, for a caveat, if you do get in the governor's mansion, don't forget HuttCast gets to have a the jacuzzi. I've been saying to everybody, I gotta be there.
I don't think there's a jacuzzi there, but we can do a HuttCast from the governor's office. Yes,
we'll put a blender in the tub and run that or something. Anything. I've never been there, and I'd like to go there sometime.
It's beautiful. One of the things that Governor Mark Dayton was so gracious with, welcoming particularly legislators and I know members of the public into his home, and so to sit and have breakfast with the governor. As someone who is going to be negotiating with him, to sit across the table and have a conversation, and not everything was about, let's argue about this issue.
Right. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. Made it easier to figure out where the sticking points were going to be, where hot button issues lived. And so he used that mansion in a way that I would like to as well.
Okay. So just to be clear now, HuttCast gets to be at the mansion. Okay.
We will do a show. There are no hot tub blender promises. Okay.
Well, I'll take you up on that someday. All right. So where did we leave off? So we talked about that. We covered this. Oh, here's one. Now, this might spin you sideways, and I don't want you down the rabbit hole, but someone wrote into me before we did our episode, and they asked me, ask her about the Feeding Our Future scandal. What's with this? I don't even know nothing about it.
Feeding Our Futures, there was hundreds of millions of dollars in federal money given to the Minnesota Department of Education to make sure school-age children had meals available to them. So the Department of Education found an agent, Feeding Our Futures, who was going to reach out to smaller nonprofits and help them comply and get money. And so Feeding Our Futures was supposed to find local community support that could provide meals to the kids. And when they submitted receipts, they would get paid. Well, it looks like there were a lot of kids not fed. It looks like that money was absconded with to buy property, to buy cars, to buy lavish gifts. And the FBI is involved. I've asked the legislative auditor to look into this issue. And the legislative auditor has worked with the FBI a lot. And they let the FBI go first, frankly, because if there is a crime, our legislative auditor doesn't want to get in the way. But importantly, by following the FBI investigation, they can find loopholes and know who we should hold accountable, even if there's not criminal accountability. But really importantly, how do we change so this does not happen again? The legislative auditor came up with some really solid suggestions for CCAP fraud, for example, when that was going on. They helped us see where people were creating holes and letting money flow through. And this is a huge amount of money. Kids were not fed. There is no excuse. I hope the FBI finds that there was criminal activity going on and holds those people accountable, but also that the legislative auditor then comes back with good recommendations for how we prevent this from ever happening again.
Wow. Well, I answered it for him. He left me a message on Hatebook, and here we are. So I got to the information for you, so give us a thumbs up on that. Well, that's such a big thing. My head's still spinning on that.
And it is so much money. And the federal government, this is one of the problems with COVID. They flooded so much money into this state because everybody sort of panicked. Childcare, feeding kids, vaccinations, tests. Let's just keep throwing money at things. And sometimes the money was just more than our system could handle in a way that was accountable and deliverable.
No checks and balances.
No checks and balances. And here's, a lot of people talk about limiting emergency powers. Yes, limit emergency powers. I'd say the House and Senate need to agree to advance emergency powers beyond 30 days. If the legislature wants it to be 15, that's fine, but let's get that changed. So House and Senate have to agree to extend emergency powers. But also when federal money comes in, there has to be legislative guidance, direction. Some of this federal money that came in, the legislature had no way to stop it or direct it or guide it. And that ends up with some pretty objectionable things happening.
So with no checks and balances in place, nobody's watching the end game. The money's flowing like water. Why wouldn't you take it?
Well, because you're a good person. Well, that's why you wouldn't take it.
We do that, but
I'm sorry. I don't mean to be...
We know that.
Sarcastic in any way. There are good people who are trying to do really solid work every day. And there are other opportunists who are just saying there's money and I'm going to see what I can get away with. Yeah, take it.
Again, we as a normal thinking person would say it's not ours to take. If you need it, you need it. But the opportunists will take and grab and use. And when they want to put a pandemic on it or a plandemic and they want to scare everybody into another crisis, here we are.
And unfortunately, there are people with good intentions who are sending taxpayer money, and there are taxpayers who want to feed kids, and there are hardworking people who are going to do their best to feed kids. And then there are just opportunist criminals who are saying, you know what? I don't care what happens to taxpayer money. I don't care how hard you're working to do the right thing. And I don't care if kids get fed. And when you have too much money, those people see opportunity.
Speaking of money, going into overdrive, doing a Paskey here, Jen Paskey. So let's circle back to our budget. We have a surplus, and we're still getting hit heavy on taxes. How do you fix that?
We need tax cuts in Minnesota. You and I talked about how we chase out innovators because of our tax code. We chase out our seniors because of our tax code. We chase out businesses Because of our tax code, we chase out people who are ready to sell their business, because if they sell it and they're based out of Florida, they have a much different tax experience than they do here in Minnesota. So over $9 billion, almost $10 billion, and we need permanent tax cuts. This is a great opportunity for us to send a signal to the world that Minnesota is going to get our fiscal house in order, and we're going to make sure that entrepreneurs, retirees, hardworking people are welcome here in this state.
Do you believe, with all the hubbub going on, the craziness, the insane kind of actions people are putting out there, that this is the Achilles heel for Walz?
The tax cuts, I don't think, are the Achilles heel for Walz. I think the riots and locking kids out of schools are the Achilles heel for Tim Walz.
That's going to be a tough one, isn't it, for him? How do you circle back on that one?
Well, locking kids out of schools, August of 2020, all over the world, science was telling us, and by example, schools were telling us we can have elementary children safely back in their schools. And the fact that we didn't has hurt our kids. Mental health issues, learning gaps, and frankly, delayed learning. Things like when you have masks over your face all the time, learning to read emotions, learning to properly form speech,
right?
Proper social connection. Those things are really important in elementary school. And because we separated our kids from each other, when there were ways to safely be together and in person and learn to socially connect, we hurt our kids. And there are families all over this state that know it, and they're not going to forget.
Well, then let that be an Achilles heel, then, right?
Amen. As it should be. This isn't a political game for me. This is real. This happened to our families. This is what happens when you listen to only one side of the argument and you don't think about the outcomes. I was saying in May of 2020, there are going to be mental health problems. We cannot keep people locked up and afraid and separated without there being mental health problems, suicides and overdoses, abuse, adolescent and pediatric abuse. I cannot imagine what happened in the lives of some of those kids in families that might have otherwise been very stable. But the stress of having a business shut down or not being able to go to school, the things that could have been lessened had we listened.
I don't know why he didn't listen. I don't know why a lot of governors didn't listen and our president didn't listen. And more of a sandwich for a different day. All right, let's rev this up a little bit and make some more happy instead of the.
Yeah.
So, tell me your first thing if you get the chair. What are you going to do?
First thing, we need a hiring freeze. And this is we're going to end up going down the rabbit hole a little bit here, but I've been in the Senate long enough. There's some things that just need to be done. Hiring freeze, any position open more than 180 days needs to be canceled. We're going to have to reevaluate some of how we operate as a state. And that includes if telecommuting works for you to still do your job and deliver to the people of Minnesota, then why are we paying for office space for you? Let's look at shrinking some of our leases, pulling back so that we don't have to maintain buildings that are mostly empty. The goal is to serve the citizens, not to have government of a certain size. And so those are some things we need to do very early on. Oh, my goodness, the list is so long.
Right.
Let's look at the way we have nonprofits working in our state. I would love to get internal audits in every single agency to make sure they're complying with basic accounting practices. For example, there's no reason that a nonprofit that wasn't even in existence 2 years ago should have gotten that much money. Let's just be clear.
Okay.
So some of those accountability nerdy things, but also I'm going to have a commissioner in charge of education who recognizes that parents are the primary educators of their children. Parents and teachers need to be partners. We need high standards in this state, no excuses. We're going to focus on fundamentals like reading and math. We don't need activism in our classrooms. Our kids need to learn those basic skills that prepare them to be fully functioning adults. Let's focus on that instead of what the radical left is pushing in many of our classrooms. Some of it completely inappropriate for elementary students, others of it a distraction from those core things that Minnesota kids aren't learning. Keep in mind, our high-end test scores are starting to drop. Our minority students, among the worst reading gap in the country. Mississippi is passing us. Not that, Mississippi's a kind of bar, but they're making sure their kids know how to read. So let's do that day one. And then when the legislature gets into session, let's work on a budget that shrinks the size and scope of government. Let's work on voter ID. Why do we need voter ID? And provisional ballots and the other things that secure elections. Stacey Abrams in Georgia will still tell you that she won the governor's race. It's not just Republicans who say elections aren't secure. Stacey Abrams is a Democrat, and she said that she can't trust elections. We're a representative republic. If we can't trust our elections, then we're going to have a really hard time moving government forward. Things are going to get worse, not better. Let's make sure that we are championing the good that law enforcement can do. Hold them to high standards. Appoint people to the post board who understand the profession of policing, not activism in our police ranks. The Sentencing Guidelines Commission. Let's make sure, again, if you are committing crimes against correction officers, against police officers, that you get extra penalties, not a deviation down. Let's appoint judges who close the revolving door so carjackers are held accountable instead of sent back out onto our streets.
Right.
These are the things the governor can do to change some of our biggest challenges. Public safety and education are the two biggest challenges Minnesota has right now. We can get our tax house in order, but if our people aren't safe and our kids aren't educated, we're not going to have a thriving economy. We're not going to have that innovation that you and I talked about early on that brings more patents, that brings more talent to this state, that will grow our economy. Let's make sure we open our minds and our forests. Let's make sure it's easy to farm in the state of Minnesota so that those core natural resources, those abundant blessings that we have, can be put to next best use by the people of this state. Hardworking, people who are stewards, people who want to pass on a state that is better than the one they found. Minnesotans don't want to create toxic waste in our mining. They do that in China. Minnesotans would never do that. They want to be responsible for the way we manage our forests. They want their farmland, just like my parents did, to be healthy and productive and be able to pass on to the next generation. This is what Minnesota does at our core. And so let's make it possible. There is a really bright future ahead of us. There is so much we can do. There are some problems we need to fix, but let's go forward with that idea that we wake up every day, work to our God-given potential, help our kids prepare to achieve it, and that our communities are safe. Imagine what that kind of Minnesota looks like.
Have you heard of the new iron polymer lithium batteries? Now, I'm doing this because I've did it to the other guys who were on the show. And I want your opinion on weigh-in. So lithium ion is a mined substance from China. But iron phosphate polymers are from, Minnesota taconite range.
Right. Did these guys come out of, I want to say they came out of MIT. They were actually in the Wall Street Journal 3 months ago.
So you've heard of this?
Yeah.
Okay, so 1 out of 4 have heard of this, and you're on my show. So you're the governor, and you're saying, hey, you guys made this work. It's going to take the Iron Range to the next level, which it should have been.
Yes.
You have nickel and copper. One of the guys was telling me. How are you going to push on that to make them more successful in Minnesota? Deregulate? What's the plan?
I think we need to look at a regulatory structure that, again, is a mark of good stewardship. So we're not creating toxicity, but that we're looking forward to what's next. No matter what you think of global warming, we know that people are going to demand zero carbon, low carbon, environmentally sensitive products. And so if we can be the place where we make electric car batteries without becoming dependent on China.
Yes.
I mean, think about this right now in Russia. The largest stores of nickel and palladium are completely under Russian control, but we have nickel here and we have palladium in Montana. If we want to make stainless steel, we're going to need nickel and we're going to need palladium. It is a national defense strategy to have access to nickel and palladium right here in the United States. It is a national defense strategy to use our minerals to their next best use and not be dependent on China. And it is immoral to make products with slave labor that create a toxic environment like they do in so many places around this world. That would never happen here in Minnesota. And we need to be really clear. We will be stewards. We will treat our workers with respect, but this is part of our national defense, and Minnesota can be a critical asset in preparing for next generation innovation as well as our national defense strategy.
Well, I would hold that a whole lot of people on the Iron Range, if we could get this push to make this happen. Of course, they still got temperature compensation problems to do with. There's a lot of things involved with electric cars that is very difficult in the free zone.
Agreed. But I have a bill right now that would work on carbon sequestration and carbon capture. We have magnesium deposits. If you push CO2 into magnesium deposits, it remineralizes.
It demins?
It remineralizes.
Okay.
And there is a company out east who started figuring out how to capture carbon with magnesium and trap it then in the earth. We have magnesium deposits here. I think we should be looking at what's next.
Interesting. I didn't know that. I suppose with your background and all that stuff, it makes sense that you would know this, right?
Sometimes nerds get things before other folks do, yes.
You're talking to a nerd now. I'm pretty nerdish.
That's okay.
Okay, so with that, the hydrogen stuff we worked on before, that's not a PEM system. PEM is a permeable system, but this is the stuff that we talked about earlier was a reaction system by potassium hydroxide and water, so what they call it Brown's gas.
Yes.
And the patent I hold is specifically for taking the car, removing the fuel, or ratiometrically removing fuel as you increase hydrogen production to a cell, which we modulate and control through patented ideas. If we could make that work, and at $7 a gallon, now we did a study with Caterpillar out in Peoria, Illinois, and we did it right here in the Twin Cities. We had a dyno room rented, a CAT C66. We've created a test bed for this unit. We showed that in our test through Virtual Kraus at the time, did the audit on it, and we made 22% gain at 40% efficiency and 12% gain at 50% efficiency, so it's half throttle.
Okay.
But because of the laws written, we couldn't push on that because it was tampering or altering with emissions, but the law at the time says you can't defeat or make worse. It did not say you can't make better.
Well, of course, we need to let you make emissions better.
Right. But they wouldn't push on it because they were like, hey, you're altering, you're doing this. Even though we've proved it in dyno,
right,
to the heads of Caterpillar in Illinois, they flew up for this big meeting. How would a guy like me say, I want to do this. We know it works. The technology is proven. But I can't get through the red tape, the governmental red tape.
The tampering with emissions, is that federal or state?
It's a little both. Okay.
So then we would go through a rulemaking process. I'm not a big fan of rulemaking, but also going through the legislature and saying, experimentation on reduction of emissions isn't tampering.
There we go. I like that. But we didn't have that at the time.
No. This is the squelching of innovation, because you write a law probably in the 1970s or 80s, actually. I think catalytic converters came in the 80s. Mm-hmm. I don't remember when they became mandated.
Right.
But we said you can't tamper with emissions.
Right. There it is.
One size fits all. End of discussion. Not, and that ends up being then a prohibition on experimentation. Uh-huh. It ends up being a prohibition on scaling from experiment, from, bench, or in this case, dyno level, up to something that could mimic population. And then obviously it prohibits population level testing. And so, sometimes we write laws rather bluntly. And in this case, it caught up somebody who was trying to do something novel, innovative, and ultimately good.
I know that one of the takeaways from this Caterpillar experiment was they call them tiers, tier 1s, 2, 3s, and 4s. Now, at the time, when I did the test, it was tier 3, and that was the cutting edge, but they were trying to make tier 4, which is another reduction. So here we are with the big shots of Caterpillar in this diner room and Ziegler down in Caterpillar, and they said, okay, we did our test. We went from a tier 3 to a tier 4 with the same equipment certified for tier 3, and the big chief looks at all these engineers, there's a lot of suits around, and he says, so this guy from nowhere takes this hydrogen, puts it on our engine. We jump from tier 3 to tier 4 automatically.
Wow.
And you guys, what did I just pay $4 billion for you guys to develop on tier 4?
Wow.
Well, you know what happened at that point, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, all the engineers started protecting themselves, saying, well, we need this. And after that, it can't work. It's, against God's creation, whatever. I looked at my staff and I went, well, that's the end of us. And it was literally stopped right there because we made tier 4. It did nothing besides take diesel fuel out of this engine.
Wow.
So it was a really good win for us, but it's a bittersweet for me. We proved it.
I understand.
So I like your answer. You answered it fully. The fact that there's so much red tape and the laws need to be revisited, just like ordinances in a city. You got to go back and say, okay, times change. Technology changes. What do you want to tell people out there that your takeaway?
My vision for Minnesota, and we touched on this earlier, I see the greatness of our people. I see the greatness of our resources. I see that government gets in the way, and there are some basic things that government should be doing that it's failing at. So let's start with those. Public safety is a core function of government. Mm-hmm. We cannot have people coming to Minnesota or thinking about coming to Minnesota when all the articles nationally are, it's racist and dangerous. We have got to turn this around. We need to have safe communities. People fly into our airport. It's the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. And if the headlines are Minnesota had X number of carjackings this week, who's going to want to come here to invest? Who's going to want to move here with their family? And then our reading, so public safety has to be resolved. Our reading scores are becoming a national embarrassment. Our education gap is a huge problem. Not only is it immoral to keep kids trapped in those failing schools, hold them back, waste that opportunity in their life because our public education system failed them, but employers want trained workforce. They want people who can read. So our education, changing our education system is a moral imperative, but also necessary for the growth of our economy. And then getting government out of the way, reducing regulations, just like we talked about, making it worthwhile to grow a business here. When we have people who are safe, kids who are educated, and a government that gets out of the way, that rewards people working and becoming fully to their God-given potential, we are going to have an amazing state because we are blessed with resources other states don't have. It doesn't take a miracle. It just takes hard work. That's what I want to do for Minnesota as governor. Every day to get up and think about the good of this people, the people of this state, and help them live to their God-given potential.
Outstanding exit statement. Do you want to do the thing now? Do you want to do I approve this?
I'm Michelle Benson. I approve this message.
Oh, and the first time. Look at that. Okay. Anything else you want to add? Because we are 31:12 into this second segment, and I want to make sure that we've covered everything you want to discuss.
No, I thoroughly enjoyed this. I understand you're a car guy, you're a music guy, you patent things. I think someday when I'm governor, we're going to come back and talk about things like music and cars and whatever else you have of interest in your life, because not everything's politics, not everything's policy.
Right.
Listening to the things that inspire other people lifts up all your listeners on this podcast, but me as well.
Well, we appreciate you. You know, you guys are like 24/7 running around, and I appreciate you coming in on a Sunday and taking your time and just being, on the HuttCast.
Thank you.
So we're going to pull the pin at 31:59. I appreciate everyone listening. I hope you take some solace in the words from Michelle, and we can have some learning and growing. So for HuttCast, signing off. Until next time.
I'm Michelle Benson, candidate for governor. Together, we can beat Tim Walz.
And that's a wrap for HuttCast. HuttCast is, again, a pragmatic approach to seeing things how some people see them. If you like our show, give us a thumbs up on the Facebook site. Again, for HuttCast, thank you again. Have a wonderful evening.